I have to do this, Mom. It's for your own good.
This is my home. I won't go.
Mrs. Johnson, perhaps we can discuss this further. She doesn't need to stay. She's perfectly fine.
No, that's not what we agreed. Mrs. Smith, why are you so upset?
You will be in the streets and no one will believe you. Your house is mine now.
You have nothing. What is this? Oh my goodness, what does that say?
The moment my son took my purse, my phone, and the keys to the home I had lived in for 46 years, I knew this was not a temporary stay. My mother gets confused, Mark told the nursing home director, speaking as though I were not standing beside him. She invents things when she's frightened. I am not confused, I said, and I never agreed to come here. Mark leaned close enough for only me to hear. By the time anyone believes you, the house will already be sold. Then he walked away. I was still watching the doors close behind him when a nurse opened my suitcase and found a sealed red envelope beneath its lining. The director read the warning written across the front, and suddenly her entire expression changed. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, please like this video and subscribe if you believe growing older should never mean losing your voice. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child betrayed you this way? And please share where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes knowing someone is listening makes a painful story a little easier to tell. Before Mark became the man who left me beneath the fluorescent lights of Cedar Ridge, he had once been the little boy who slept with one hand wrapped around my finger. That was the part of betrayal no one warned me about. A stranger can wound you, but a child knows exactly where your heart is softest. For 46 years, the brick house on Willow Lane had been the center of my life. Thomas and I bought it when we were newly married, back when the maple tree in the front yard was thin enough for him to circle with both hands. We raised Mark there. We measured his height on the pantry door, patched the wall after he threw a baseball indoors, and stayed awake together the night he left for college. Thomas used to say a house remembered everything. After he died, I understood what he meant. Every room held him. His reading glasses remained beside his chair. One of his flannel shirts still hung behind the laundry room door because I could not bring myself to move it. On quiet mornings, I sometimes imagined hearing his slow footsteps in the hallway. We had been married for 48 years. Thomas was not a dramatic man. He loved through small, dependable things. He warmed my car on winter mornings, sharpened the pencils beside my crossword puzzles, and made coffee after every argument, even when he still believed he was right. His death came 18 months before Mark drove me to Cedar Ridge. A stroke took Thomas quickly. One evening, he was complaining that the local news had become too loud, and 2 days later, I was sitting beside a hospital bed, holding a hand that no longer squeezed mine back. After the funeral, Mark seemed to become the son I had feared I had lost. He began visiting every Saturday. He brought groceries, checked the gutters, changed light bulbs I could still reach, and insisted on mowing the lawn. At first, I was grateful. "You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff anymore, Mom," he told me. There was tenderness in his voice then, or at least something that sounded like tenderness. Grief makes you hungry for kindness. It can make ordinary attention feel like rescue. Mark started sorting my mail into neat piles. He offered to set up automatic payments for my utilities. He called on Sunday evenings to ask whether I had remembered my medication, even though I had never forgotten it. For a while, I believed losing Thomas had reminded him that family mattered. Then the questions began. "Do you know what houses in this neighborhood are selling for? Did Dad ever refinance? Where did he keep the investment statements?" I answered, because I had no reason not to. Mark was my only child. I had spent most of my life believing privacy inside a family was the same thing as distrust. One afternoon, he stood in the kitchen studying the pantry door where his childhood height marks remained beneath layers of varnish. "This place must be worth a fortune now," he said. "It is worth a home," I replied. He laughed, but his eyes stayed on the room. Another time, while helping me carry boxes from the basement, he asked whether Thomas and I had updated our wills. The question stopped me halfway up the stairs. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just making sure things are organized. You don't want the state deciding what happens." "The state is not deciding anything, so you did update it." His tone was still polite, but impatience sat beneath it. I told him my legal affairs were handled. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, he frowned. You always make everything so mysterious. I am entitled to privacy, Mark. I'm your son. Yes, I said, not my accountant. He did not speak to me for the rest of the afternoon. That silence unsettled me more than an argument. Mark had always been charming when he wanted something, but coldness was the punishment he used when charm failed. A week later, he apologized with flowers. He said work had been stressful. He said he only worried because I was alone. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Vanessa reinforced the story. She would call and say, Mark barely sleeps because he's afraid something will happen to you. It was strange. No one asked whether I was afraid. They told me what Mark feared, what Mark needed, and how much Mark was sacrificing. Meanwhile, I heard less and less from my granddaughter Emma. Emma and I had always been close. As a child, she spent summers at Willow Lane helping me shelve books at the school library where I worked. She had inherited Thomas' dry humor and my habit of underlining sentences in novels. But after Thomas died, her calls became brief and irregular. Whenever I asked Mark about her, he said college was overwhelming. She loves you, Mom. She just needs space. Once I called Emma directly. The call went to voicemail. A few minutes later, Mark called me. You shouldn't pressure her, he said. I left one message. She feels guilty when she can't visit. I never asked her to feel guilty. You don't have to ask. His words made me wonder whether I had become burdensome without realizing it. That was how Mark's influence worked. He rarely accused me directly. He handed me a doubt and let me carry it alone. Still, small details refused to fit together. Mail I expected never arrived. A bank statement had already been opened. Mark knew the amount of my property taxes even though I had never told him. When I asked, he said I must have forgotten. I had not forgotten. One evening I sat at Thomas' desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a yellow legal pad with his handwriting on the first page. Seeing it nearly broke me. I remembered the final private conversation we had in the hospital before his speech became difficult. Mark had visited earlier that day. After he left, Thomas gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Ruth, he whispered, promise me something. I leaned close. Never sign anything Mark brings you, not without Susan reading it first. I stared at him. Why would you say that? Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them again, fear had replaced the calm I had always known in him. Because he asked me for money, he said. More than once. And the last time he lied about why. I wanted names, amounts, proof. But a nurse entered. Thomas grew weaker, and we never finished that conversation. For months after his death, I told myself grief had made Thomas suspicious. Sitting alone at his desk, remembering Mark's questions about the house, I was no longer certain. For the first time, I wondered whether my son's sudden devotion had begun, not because he was afraid of losing me, but because he was calculating what he might gain. 3 weeks after I found Thomas' note, Mark arrived at my house without calling. It was raining hard that afternoon. Water ran from the shoulders of his expensive gray coat as he stepped into the foyer, but he did not remove it. He looked as though he had come to deliver bad news and feared he might lose his courage if he sat down. Mom, we need to talk. I led him into the kitchen and poured coffee. He did not touch his cup. For several minutes, he stared at the table. Then he placed both hands over his face and let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. The Riverside Project is in trouble. Mark had spent nearly 2 years promoting Riverside Commons, a development of luxury townhouses on the eastern edge of Columbus. He spoke about it at every holiday dinner. According to him, the project would finally establish him as one of the most successful real estate brokers in the county. What kind of trouble, I asked. The financing collapsed. Construction costs went up, 2 investors pulled out, and the bank wants additional collateral. How much do you need? He hesitated. $200,000. The number struck me so sharply that I thought I had misheard him. Mark, I don't have $200,000 sitting in an account. I know, but the house is worth more than $600,000 now. There it was. Not concern, not grief. The house. He opened a leather folder and slid several papers across the table. We could use the property as security for a short-term loan. I would make every payment. Once the first units sell, I'd clear the debt completely. I did not touch the papers. You want me to mortgage my home. I want you to help protect our family's future. My home is my future. His jaw tightened. You're living alone in a 4-bedroom house. Half the rooms are never used. That does not make them yours. I didn't say they were mine. You brought loan documents into my kitchen before asking whether I was willing. His expression changed. The wounded son disappeared, and the impatient businessman took his place. I came prepared because time matters. To you. To all of us. Emma's education. Our retirement. Everything depends on this project succeeding. Emma's education should not depend on my house. He pushed the folder closer. Just read it. I remembered Thomas gripping my wrist in the hospital. Never sign anything Mark brings you. I will have Susan review it. Mark's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. Why do you always involve that woman? Because she is my attorney. I'm your son, and this is a legal document. He began pacing between the refrigerator and the sink. You know what your problem is. You assume I'm trying to cheat you. I did not say that. You didn't have to. I remained seated, though my heart was beating painfully fast. I am not mortgaging the house. He turned toward me. The anger in his face frightened me, not because it was loud, but because it was cold. That house is going to be mine eventually anyway. The room seemed to become very still. I looked at the pantry door with the pencil marks showing how tall he had been at 7, 12, and 16. For one confused second, I saw the boy standing there instead of the man before me. Then I looked back at him. An inheritance is not ownership, Mark. I didn't mean it like that. You meant exactly what you said. His voice rose. I'm trying to save something I spent years building, and you're sitting here protecting bricks and furniture as if they matter more than your own child. That home contains my security, my memories, and nearly 5 decades of my life. And I'm your son, yes. But being my son does not entitle you to everything I have. He stared at me with such bitterness that I barely recognized him. You've changed since Dad died. No, I said quietly. I think I'm finally seeing what he was worried about. Mark's face went pale. What is that supposed to mean? I almost told him about Thomas' warning. Something stopped me. Take your papers and leave. He swept the folder from the table. You're making a terrible mistake. No. I'm refusing to make one. He left without saying goodbye. For 4 days I heard nothing from him. By the 5th day, guilt had begun its quiet work. I imagined him losing his business, his home, and his reputation. I imagined Emma being forced to leave college because I had refused to help. That Friday, Vanessa appeared at my door, carrying chicken soup and a loaf of homemade bread. She hugged me before I could decide whether I wanted her to. We're all under so much stress, she said. Over lunch. Vanessa explained that Mark had not been sleeping. She said he paced the house at night and blamed himself for trusting the wrong investors. He feels like he failed everyone, she whispered. I'm sorry he is suffering. He believes you think he's a criminal. I said no to a loan. To him it felt like you said no to your family. The words were gentle, but the accusation beneath them was clear. Vanessa took my hand. Ruth, we could lose everything. The house, our savings, maybe even Emma's tuition. Mark is too proud to say it, but your decision could destroy our marriage. That is not fair. Fair doesn't matter when a family is drowning. For one dangerous moment, I nearly surrendered. I pictured Emma carrying boxes out of her dormitory. I pictured Mark sitting alone in a dark house ruined because his mother had refused to help him. Then I remembered that neither Mark nor Vanessa had asked how losing my home might affect me. I will not mortgage Willow Lane, I said. Vanessa released my hand. Her sadness vanished so quickly that I understood it had been partly performed. I hope you can live with what happens next. After she left, I called Susan Bell. Susan had handled our legal affairs for more than 20 years. She listened without interrupting as I described the loan papers, Mark's anger, and Vanessa's visit. Do not sign anything, she said. Not even a document he claims is only an authorization to obtain information. I wasn't planning to. I also want you to begin keeping records. Records of what every request for money, every threat, every message involving the house or your accounts. The word threat made my stomach tighten. He is still my son. I know. That is why this is difficult. Susan advised me to save voicemails, print emails, and write down dates and exact phrases after every uncomfortable conversation. She also suggested that I record discussions when Mark visited, as Ohio law permitted a participant in a conversation to record it. At first, the idea felt like a betrayal. Then I remembered Mark saying the house would belong to him eventually. I bought a small digital recorder and kept it inside the drawer beside Thomas' legal pad. 2 days later, Mark left me a voicemail. "You still have time to fix this, Mom. Don't force me to find another way." I saved it. The following week, Susan called me into her office. A lender had contacted her while verifying information connected to my property. Someone had already requested preliminary financing against Willow Lane. The application had not been completed, but it contained my address, my estimated home value, and the amount remaining on my mortgage, which was nothing. At the bottom of the inquiry was the name of the applicant, Ruth Patterson. I had never spoken to that lender, and I had never authorized my son to speak for me. After Susan showed me the financing inquiry, I stopped telling myself that Mark was simply desperate. Desperation might explain why a son begged his mother for help. It did not explain why he used her name without permission. Susan made copies of everything and placed the originals in a locked file. "We still don't know how far he has gone," she said. "So for now, do not confront him." Every instinct in me resisted that advice. I wanted to drive to Mark's office, place the papers on his desk, and demand the truth. But Susan reminded me that if Mark believed I knew about the application, he might destroy evidence or create a story before we understood the full scheme. "Let him think you are unaware," she said. Pretending became one of the hardest things I had ever done. Mark resumed his Saturday visits as though nothing had happened. He brought groceries, checked the furnace, and asked whether I had been sleeping well. I answered calmly while the recorder in the kitchen drawer captured every word. At the same time, small pieces of my life began moving beyond my control. My neighbor Carol stopped inviting me to her weekly card game. When I asked whether I had offended her, she looked embarrassed. "Mark said evenings were becoming difficult for you," she explained. "He said you sometimes got confused after dark." I stared at her. "I have never been confused after dark." Carol reached for my hand. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I thought he was protecting you." A few days later, the pharmacy called Mark instead of me about a routine refill. A charity receipt I had been expecting arrived at his address. Then I discovered that he had canceled a lunch with 2 former colleagues from the library, telling them I was too tired to attend. Each incident seemed small enough to explain away. Together they formed something far more frightening. Mark was not merely trying to obtain my money. He was constructing a version of me that other people would believe. In his version, I was forgetful, fragile, and increasingly incapable of making decisions. Every time I disagreed with him, he could call it confusion. Every time I became angry, he could call it paranoia. The realization changed how I moved through my own life. I began keeping a calendar of appointments, saving grocery receipts, and writing down every phone call. I checked the stove twice before bed, not because I doubted myself, but because I feared Mark might later claim I had left it burning. He had made me feel as though I needed evidence to prove I was still myself. The most disturbing moment came during a routine appointment with Dr. Helen Morris. Mark offered to drive me. I almost refused, but Susan had advised me to observe what he was doing rather than alert him, so I agreed. At the clinic, a nurse asked whether I had experienced any recent changes in memory. "No," I answered. Mark interrupted. "She's been forgetting small things." I turned toward him. "What things?" He gave the nurse a patient, sorrowful smile. "Appointments, medication, conversations we've already had." "That is not true." "Mom, it's nothing to be ashamed of." His voice was gentle enough to make me sound defensive. When the nurse asked whether I lived alone safely, Mark said I had left the stove on twice and wandered outside late at night. I felt heat rise through my chest. "I have never wandered anywhere." Mark lowered his voice. "You may not remember." The nurse's expression changed. She began looking at me with concern instead of listening to what I was saying. Dr. Morris entered a few minutes later. She had treated me for nearly a decade and knew I was not a woman who became easily confused. As Mark repeated his claims, she watched both of us carefully. Then she asked him to step outside. He hesitated. I should stay. She gets anxious when she's alone. I would like to speak with my patient privately, Dr. Morris replied. After the door closed, I began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears simply came because someone had finally created a space in which Mark could not speak over me. I am not losing my mind, I said. Dr. Morris pulled her chair closer. I don't believe you are. But I need you to tell me exactly what is happening. I told her about the loan request, the unauthorized financing inquiry, the redirected mail, and the stories Mark was spreading. I also told her about Thomas' warning. She listened without interrupting. Then she performed a formal cognitive assessment. She asked me to remember words, identify dates, follow instructions, solve simple problems, and explain how I would respond to different situations. I completed every section. When we finished, she placed the pen on her desk. Ruth, your results are within the normal range for your age. You understand your medical conditions, your finances, and the consequences of your decisions. She entered detailed notes into my record and printed a signed statement confirming that I was fully capable of making my own medical and financial choices. I held that paper with both hands. It should not have felt like a victory to prove that I still belonged to myself. But it did. Dr. Morris also documented that Mark had reported behaviors I denied, and for which she had found no supporting evidence. She advised me to contact Susan immediately. That afternoon, Susan prepared documents revoking the limited power of attorney I had granted Mark during Thomas' final illness. The original authority had allowed him to communicate with insurance companies and assist with hospital expenses. It had never permitted him to sell my house, obtain loans, or control my personal accounts. I signed the revocation in front of a notary. Susan sent official notices to my bank insurance providers, medical clinic, and county records office. Then she proposed another safeguard. If Mark tries to place you in assisted living or a nursing facility, she said, we need a way to make sure someone investigates before accepting his version of events. Together with Dr. Morris, she created what they called a resident protection file. It contained my competency assessment, the revocation of Mark's authority, emergency contact information and instructions requiring any care facility to notify Susan immediately if I appeared to be admitted under pressure. Susan sealed the documents inside a red envelope. I asked why it had to be hidden. Because if Mark knows it exists, he may take it from you. The answer chilled me. Thomas had once built a narrow compartment beneath the lining of an old suitcase we used for important papers while traveling. Susan and I placed the envelope there. At her request, I gave no indication that I had taken these precautions. For the next several days, we waited. Susan believed Mark had already used something more dangerous than the old limited power of attorney. The lender's inquiry referred to authority broad enough to borrow against my property. We need to learn what document he is presenting, she said. If it is what I suspect, this is no longer manipulation, it is forgery. The confirmation arrived the following Monday. Susan called me before breakfast and told me to come to her office. On her desk lay a copy of a newly filed power of attorney document. It gave Mark sweeping control over my property, bank accounts, housing, and medical decisions. At the bottom of the final page was my name. The signature looked almost perfect, but I had never signed it. Susan examined my face. Ruth, this document was notarized 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks earlier, I had been home alone planting tulip bulbs in the backyard. Yet according to the paper in front of us, I had appeared before a notary and willingly surrendered control of my entire life to my son. For nearly a week after Susan showed me the forged power of attorney, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house sounded different. Every car slowing in front of Willow Lane made me glance through the curtains. It was strange how quickly a place that had always made me feel safe could begin to feel vulnerable. I wasn't afraid of burglars. I was afraid of paperwork, afraid of signatures I had never written, afraid that somewhere behind a polished desk someone would believe a lie simply because it had been printed on official letterhead. Susan remained calm. He's moving faster now, she told me during one of our phone calls. That's actually good news. I don't understand. People who believe they're running out of time make mistakes. I wished I shared her confidence. 3 days later, Mark called. Mom, how about lunch tomorrow, just the two of us? His voice sounded warm again, almost cheerful. We haven't spent any time together in weeks. I hesitated. Susan had advised me not to avoid him completely. If he believes you've become suspicious, he'll change his strategy, she had warned. So I agreed. The next morning, Mark pulled into my driveway just before 11. Instead of his usual SUV, he was driving a black luxury sedan I had never seen before. New car? I asked as I climbed inside. It's a company lease. He smiled easily. You like it? It's very nice. As we drove, we chatted about ordinary things: the weather, Emma's summer classes, the Cincinnati Reds. For nearly 20 minutes, he was the son I remembered. The man who used to bring me wildflowers after Little League practice. The young father who once placed newborn Emma in my arms and whispered, "Meet your grandmother." Then something changed. Instead of turning toward the restaurant district downtown, he continued east. I thought lunch was in town. It is. Another 10 minutes passed. Now we were leaving familiar neighborhoods behind. Mark. What? Where are we going? I told you. No, you didn't. He smiled without looking at me. You'll see. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I reached for my purse. My phone was inside. Before I could unlock it, Mark reached across the console. You don't need that. He took it from my hands. What are you doing? Driving safely. Give me my phone. In a minute. His voice remained perfectly calm. Too calm. I looked out the window. We passed a medical office, then a pharmacy, then a large stone entrance with elegant landscaping. The sign read, Cedar Ridge Senior Living. My heart stopped. Turn around. Mark parked the car. Mom, listen to me. No. This is temporary. You lied. He stepped out and walked to the trunk. When he opened it, I saw something that made my knees weaken. My old brown suitcase. The one Thomas had modified years earlier. The one containing the hidden compartment. You packed my suitcase. I packed what you'll need. I never agreed to come here. You don't have a choice. For the first time in my life, I truly looked at my son as if he were a stranger. You planned this. I planned what's best. I am going home. I turned toward the passenger door. Before I could open it, I heard the electronic click of the locks engaging. Mark was holding the control. Don't make this harder. Unlock the door. If you create a scene, everyone inside will think exactly what I've been telling them. My breathing became shallow. What have you been telling them? He sighed almost sadly. That you're frightened, confused, and becoming paranoid. I stared at him. You've been preparing them. I've been preparing them to help you. No. He looked directly into my eyes. I've been preparing them not to believe everything you say. The words hit harder than any slap. He had built the trap carefully. Every story told to neighbors, every phone call, every false concern, every conversation at my doctor's office. He hadn't been trying to convince me. He had been convincing everyone else. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic would only help him. When he unlocked the doors, I stepped out without another word. The entrance to Cedar Ridge looked more like an upscale hotel than a nursing home. Fresh flowers stood beside the reception desk. Soft music drifted through the lobby. Residents sat talking near enormous windows overlooking carefully maintained gardens. Everything looked peaceful, which somehow made what was happening feel even crueler. A smiling receptionist welcomed us. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I looked at her. I am not checking in. Her smile faded slightly. Mark answered before she could. My mother has good days and difficult days. I am standing right here, I said. He gently touched my elbow. The gesture looked caring. It felt like handcuffs. Grace Holloway emerged from a nearby office. She was professionally dressed, perhaps in her late 50s, with calm gray eyes that seemed to notice more than most people. I'm Grace, the executive director. She offered me her hand. I shook it. My son brought me here under false pretenses. Before Grace could respond, Mark spoke smoothly. I'm sorry. She becomes frightened whenever we discuss assisted living. I never discussed assisted living, he continued as though I hadn't spoken. Her physician recommended more supervision. Another. Grace looked between us. I'd like everyone to come into my office. The room contained comfortable chairs, family photographs from resident events, and shelves filled with awards recognizing quality elder care. It should have felt welcoming. Instead, it felt like a courtroom. Mark opened a leather briefcase. He removed several folders. I've completed all the admission paperwork. Grace reviewed the documents carefully. I see you have power of attorney. Yes. He handed over the forged document. I leaned forward. That paper is fraudulent. Mark smiled sadly. This is exactly what I mentioned. Grace looked at me. Mrs. Patterson, are you saying this isn't your signature? No. Mark spoke softly. Mom, remember what Dr. Sanders said about becoming upset. I have never met a Dr. Sanders. Grace's eyebrows moved almost imperceptibly. What physician is Dr. Sanders? My mother's memory clinic. I've never been to a memory clinic. He placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. See? I pulled away. Stop touching me. He sighed. I'm sorry. Then he looked back at Grace. You understand what we've been dealing with. I realized something terrifying. Every time I defended myself, he interpreted my defense as evidence of illness. If I became emotional, I was unstable. If I became angry, I was irrational. If I insisted he was lying, I was paranoid. The trap allowed no normal reaction. Grace continued reading. I'll need Mrs. Patterson's identification. I have it, Mark answered. He removed my driver's license from my wallet, then my Medicare card, then my insurance information. He had already taken possession of everything. My phone, I said. I'll keep it safe. My house keys. I'll manage the property. My purse. I'll bring it later. No. My voice became firmer. You will give them back. He ignored me completely. Instead, he pulled another folder from his briefcase. I've also started arrangements regarding her home. It'll probably need to be sold to help pay for long-term care. The room went silent. I looked directly at Grace. I have never authorized the sale of my house. Mark didn't even flinch. Mom doesn't understand her financial situation anymore. I understand it perfectly. Grace slowly closed the folder in front of her. She studied me for several long seconds. Then she asked quietly, Mrs. Patterson, did you agree to be admitted to Cedar Ridge today? No. It was the simplest answer I had given all morning. No, I repeated. I believed my son was taking me to lunch. For the first time since I entered the building, I saw uncertainty cross Grace Holloway's face. She looked back at Mark. He immediately answered before she could ask another question. She's embarrassed. This is completely normal. He stood. I'll let you finish the paperwork. I have another appointment. He walked toward me, leaned close enough that only I could hear him, and whispered, By the time anyone figures this out, Willow Lane will belong to someone else. Then he picked up my purse, slipped my phone into his jacket pocket, took my house keys, and walked out of the office without looking back. I stood frozen, listening to the lobby doors close. Grace remained silent for several moments. Then one of the nurses wheeled my suitcase into the office to inventory my belongings. As she unzipped it and lifted the clothing inside her fingers, caught on something beneath the inner lining. There seems to be another compartment, she said. She carefully reached inside and withdrew a thick, sealed red envelope. Across the front, in Susan Bell's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only by the executive director if Ruth Patterson is admitted against her will." Grace's expression changed instantly. She looked from the envelope, to me, and then toward the doors through which my son had just disappeared. Grace held the red envelope in both hands as though it weighed far more than paper should. No one spoke. The nurse who had discovered it looked from Grace to me, then quietly stepped back toward the door. Across the front of the envelope, beneath Susan Bell's signature, another line appeared in bold black letters. Confidential legal instructions open only with the written consent of Ruth Patterson. Grace looked at me, Mrs. Patterson, did you know this was here? Yes. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. You placed it there. My attorney did. We hoped no one would ever need to open it. The room became silent again. Grace rested the envelope on her desk instead of breaking the seal. I need to understand something. Ask. If what you've told me is true, then you expected someone might try to admit you against your will. I prayed it would never happen. She studied my face for a long moment. You sound remarkably prepared. I've had months to think about what my son might do. Those words were harder to say aloud than I expected. Months. Not days, not hours. Months of watching my own child slowly erase my independence before attempting to erase my freedom. Grace folded her hands together. Our facility takes resident rights very seriously. I believe that. However, she continued carefully, your son presented documents that appear legally valid. If I open confidential legal material without proper authorization, there could be consequences. I understand. She slid a blank sheet of paper toward me. If you are mentally capable of making this decision, I need you to provide written consent, allowing me to open the envelope. I nodded immediately. She hesitated. I'm also going to ask 2 staff members to witness your signature. I welcome that. Within minutes, a charge nurse and Cedar Ridge's compliance officer entered the office. Grace explained only that an important legal matter required witnesses. She handed me a pen. I read every word before signing. My hands were steady. Oddly enough, that surprised me. An hour earlier, my entire life had collapsed. Now somehow I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Perhaps because I had finally reached the point where pretending everything would somehow improve was no longer possible. The truth had nowhere left to hide. After I signed, the compliance officer signed. Then the nurse. Grace carefully placed the consent beside the sealed envelope. We'll open it shortly. Before she could continue, another staff member knocked softly. Mrs. Patterson's room is ready. The words struck me unexpectedly. My room, as though I already belonged here. Grace noticed my expression. I know today has been traumatic. That's one word for it. I'd like you to rest while I review everything. I don't want to be treated as someone incapable of understanding what is happening. You won't be. She surprised me by handing the envelope back to me. You keep this until we're ready. That single gesture changed something inside me. For the first time that day, someone had trusted me with my own future. A nursing assistant named Linda escorted me upstairs. Room 214 overlooked a peaceful courtyard where several residents sat beneath flowering dogwoods. The room itself was clean and comfortable. A neatly made bed, a small sitting chair, a bookshelf. Family photographs from previous residents had been removed, leaving empty spaces waiting for someone else's memories. Mine. The thought nearly broke me. Linda helped carry my suitcase inside. I'm sorry your first day has been difficult. I smiled weakly. You've been very kind. If you need anything, just press the call button. After she left, I sat alone on the edge of the bed. The silence felt overwhelming. This morning I had expected lunch with my son. Now I was sitting in a room that strangers believed might become my permanent home. I looked around slowly. Thomas's framed photograph rested on the bedside table. Mark had packed it. Why did guilt persuade him to include it? Or had he believed that a photograph would somehow compensate for stealing my life? I reached for the frame. I'm sorry, I whispered to Thomas. I should have listened sooner. The afternoon passed in a blur of orientation meetings, medication reviews, and paperwork. Each staff member remained polite, professional, careful. Yet I noticed subtle differences from person to person. Some spoke directly to me. Others looked toward the admission papers before answering my questions. Paper carried enormous authority, far more than truth. During dinner, I met several residents. One woman introduced herself 3 separate times within 15 minutes because Alzheimer's disease had stolen her short-term memory. Another gentleman proudly described his military service despite using a wheelchair after a stroke. No one treated me unkindly, yet I could not escape the feeling that I did not belong among people whose medical needs had genuinely brought them there. I belonged in my own kitchen, watering Thomas's tomato plants, watching cardinals gather beneath the maple tree. After dinner, Grace knocked gently on my door. "May I come in?" "Please." She carried the red envelope. "I've spoken with our legal department, and they advised me not to rush." A small part of me sank. "But," she continued, "I've also spent several hours reviewing your admission records." She placed a folder on the table. "There are inconsistencies." My pulse quickened. "What kind?" "The dates on your son's documents don't align with some of the medical information he provided." I remained silent. "There are also statements about cognitive evaluations from physicians whose names don't appear anywhere in your medical history." "So you believe me?" "I believe something deserves much closer examination." Before I could answer, the telephone on the bedside table rang. Grace answered, because the room had not yet been fully assigned in the system. She listened quietly. Her expression hardened. "Yes, I understand. No, I cannot agree to that." She hung up. "Was that Mark?" She nodded. "What did he want?" Grace looked directly at me. "He instructed us not to allow you to contact any attorneys." A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. "He really said that." "He also requested that we prevent unnecessary family communication because, according to him, certain relatives might confuse or agitate you." I closed my eyes. Emma. He was trying to isolate me from Emma, too. Grace continued. "He specifically mentioned Susan Bell by name. So he knows exactly what he's afraid of." She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the envelope again. "I noticed something else." "What?" She turned it over carefully. Pressed into the red wax seal was an emblem, a small oak tree surrounded by the words Patterson Community Trust. Grace stared at it for several seconds. Then she looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Recognition. "You seem surprised," I said. "I know this seal." "You do?" She nodded slowly. "Our facility almost closed 12 years ago." I frowned. "I didn't know that." "A charitable foundation stepped in with emergency funding." She gently touched the seal with one fingertip. "I've only seen this emblem once before." My heartbeat slowed, not from fear, from curiosity. Grace looked almost as puzzled as I felt. "The donor remained anonymous." She turned the envelope over once more. "But the legal trust that saved Cedar Ridge," she looked directly into my eyes, "used this exact seal." Neither of us spoke. Outside my window, the evening sun disappeared behind the trees. Inside the room, Grace carefully placed the unopened envelope on the table between us. "I think," she said quietly, "whatever is inside this file is much bigger than either of us expected." I barely slept that night. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Every few hours I woke expecting to hear Thomas unlocking our front door on Willow Lane, carrying groceries and apologizing for buying too much ice cream again. Instead, I opened my eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling. For a few seconds after each awakening, I forgot where I was. Then reality settled over me once more. My son had brought me here. Not to protect me, to silence me. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Linda knocked gently before entering with breakfast. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson." "Morning." She placed a tray beside the window. "I hope you managed to get some rest." "I've had better nights." She smiled sympathetically. "I think today might answer some of your questions." "You know about the envelope?" She nodded. "The director asked several people to be available this morning." After she left, I noticed something different. The atmosphere throughout Cedar Ridge had changed. Staff members who greeted me no longer looked uncertain. They smiled naturally. Several addressed me by name. No one spoke to me as though I were confused. Grace had apparently shared enough information to make them cautious about the circumstances of my admission. At precisely 9 o'clock, Grace arrived. With her were the compliance officer, a registered nurse named Angela, and Cedar Ridge's legal administrator, Michael Harper. Grace carried the sealed red envelope. "We're ready," she said quietly. We gathered around this conference table inside her office. Before anyone touched the envelope, Grace switched on a digital recorder. For the record, she began, "Today's meeting concerns confidential legal materials belonging to resident Ruth Patterson. Present are myself, Michael Harper, Angela Collins, and Mrs. Patterson." She looked toward me. "Mrs. Patterson, do you still consent to opening this file?" "I do." Michael nodded. Grace carefully broke the wax seal. The room seemed to hold its breath. Inside were several folders arranged with extraordinary precision. Susan had anticipated every question. The first page bore a simple title: Step 1. Verify competency. Grace removed the documents. At the top sat Dr. Helen Morris's cognitive evaluation. Beneath it was a notarized statement declaring that I remained fully competent to make my own financial, legal, and medical decisions. Attached was another document: Revocation of limited power of attorney. Grace examined the notarized seal. "The revocation was filed weeks before your admission." "Yes." Michael compared the filing date with the document Mark had presented yesterday. "They cannot both be valid." "No," I answered quietly. "Only one of them is." Angela shook her head slowly. "So your son knew this authority had already been revoked?" "I believe he did." Grace continued through the file. The next section contained certified mailing receipts showing exactly when banks, insurance companies, and county offices had been notified that Mark no longer possessed legal authority to act for me. Everything had been documented. Everything. Susan had left nothing to chance. Michael leaned back in his chair. "This is exceptionally thorough." She told me preparation would matter. Grace reached the next divider. Its title read, Evidence of Suspected Financial Exploitation. Inside were copies of the unauthorized financing inquiry, property records, printed emails, dates, voicemail transcripts, a chart listing every incident in chronological order. Even I had forgotten how much Susan had collected. Angela looked at me with visible sadness. "You've been living with this for months." I kept hoping I was wrong. Grace placed another document beside the others. "This appears to compare signatures." Michael adjusted his glasses. One page displayed my authentic signature from multiple legal documents over 20 years. Beside them appeared the signature from the forged power of attorney. The differences were subtle, almost invisible, but once pointed out impossible to ignore. "The angle of the final N," Michael murmured. "The pressure on the first letter. The spacing." He looked at Grace. "This is almost certainly forged." Silence settled across the room. No one rushed to speak. No one wanted to say aloud what we were all thinking. Mark had not made one impulsive decision. He had built an entire legal fiction. Grace picked up her office phone. "I'm calling Susan Bell." She pressed the speaker button. Susan answered on the second ring. "This is Susan." "Ms. Bell, this is Grace Holloway from Cedar Ridge." "I've been expecting your call." Grace briefly summarized what we had found. Susan listened without interruption. Then she said calmly, "The power of attorney presented by Mark Patterson is fraudulent." Michael glanced at me. Susan continued, "The genuine authority was revoked weeks ago. My office has already notified every relevant institution." Grace asked, "Should we consider Mrs. Patterson's admission potentially coerced?" "Yes." There was no hesitation. "Until proven otherwise, treat her as a fully competent resident whose admission occurred through deception." Grace thanked her and ended the call. The room suddenly felt different. Yesterday, I had been an elderly woman accused of confusion. Today, the official record was beginning to recognize me as a victim. Grace opened another folder. Inside lay copies of credit inquiries, attempted home equity applications, and banking correspondence. Michael examined them carefully. The signature used on this loan inquiry. He placed it beside the admission paperwork Mark had submitted. "Matches the signature on yesterday's documents almost perfectly." No one needed to finish the sentence. The same forgery had been used repeatedly. Around 10:30, the receptionist called Grace. "Mark Patterson is here." Every muscle in my body tightened. Grace looked at me. "Would you prefer not to see him?" "No." For too long I had allowed fear to decide my actions. Let him come. A minute later, Mark entered carrying a garment bag and another leather briefcase. His confident smile disappeared the moment he saw everyone gathered around the table. What is all this? Grace stood. Mr. Patterson, before we continue, I need to inform you that your mother's legal status is currently under review. He laughed lightly. What review? She gestured toward the documents. We have reason to question the validity of the paperwork used for her admission. His eyes immediately found the opened envelope. Color drained from his face. What is that? My property, I answered. You had no right to open it. I gave written consent. He turned toward Grace. She doesn't understand legal documents. Michael spoke before Grace could answer. We have evidence suggesting otherwise. Mark looked around the room. You people are making a terrible mistake. Grace remained calm. Mr. Patterson, your mother has been determined competent by her physician. That doctor doesn't know the whole situation. We've spoken with her attorney. Mark's expression changed. Susan Bell. Yes. His jaw tightened. I told you not to contact her. Grace's voice became noticeably firmer. You do not have authority to instruct this facility whom we may contact. Mark stepped closer to the table. I need to collect a few more of my mother's belongings. No, Grace answered immediately. They belong to me, I said. They'll stay with me. They're family property, Michael corrected him. They are Mrs. Patterson's personal property. Mark ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at me. Mom, don't let these people manipulate you. I almost smiled. Manipulation. The word sounded strangely hollow coming from him. I could say the same to you. His patience finally cracked. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand more than you think. He reached toward the folders. Grace stepped between him and the table. Do not touch these documents. I have legal authority. No. Grace's voice remained perfectly controlled. Based on the evidence currently before us, your authority appears to have been revoked prior to yesterday's admission. He stared at her in disbelief. Who says, I do? She held his gaze. And until this matter is resolved, any attempt to remove Mrs. Patterson from this facility or interfere with her legal representation will be documented and reported as potential elder abuse. The words landed like a hammer. Potential elder abuse. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge, I watched confidence leave my son's face. He looked at me. Not with guilt, not with sadness, with calculation. His mind was already searching for another way out. As he slowly backed toward the office door, his eyes fell one final time on the stack of documents lying open on Grace's desk. He had expected to find an isolated old woman. Instead, he had walked into a room full of witnesses. And he still had no idea that the last section of the red file, the thickest section of all, had not yet been opened. Mark left without another word. The office door closed behind him, but the tension he carried into the room remained. For several seconds, no one moved. Grace slowly exhaled and looked toward the unopened section of the red file resting on the conference table. Unlike the earlier folders, this one was bound with a dark blue ribbon. Across the front, Susan had written another instruction in careful block letters. Final section to be opened only after competency has been verified. Grace untied the ribbon. Inside was a thick packet of legal documents, several certified copies of trust agreements, and a handwritten letter addressed to her personally. She unfolded the letter first. Dear Ms. Holloway, she began reading aloud. If you are holding this letter, then the situation I feared has likely become reality. Before proceeding, please know that every document enclosed has been reviewed by independent counsel and may be verified through the Patterson Community Trust. Grace stopped reading. She looked up at me. I honestly have no idea what this is. I smiled faintly. Neither did Mark. She continued. Many years ago, my late husband Thomas Patterson and I made a decision that we shared with almost no one, not even our son. My chest tightened. I had not read this letter since Susan helped prepare it months earlier. Hearing Thomas's name spoken aloud inside Cedar Ridge felt strangely comforting. Grace turned the page. Our family once inherited approximately 200 acres of farmland outside Lancaster, Ohio. Mark believed we still owned the land, but decades ago we quietly sold it after determining that none of us wished to continue farming. Michael looked toward me. You never mentioned any farmland. Very few people knew. Thomas had inherited the property from his uncle nearly 30 years earlier. We had spent countless weekends there during Mark's childhood. He learned to fish in the small creek crossing the northern edge of the property. He chased butterflies through wildflower fields. He built crooked tree houses that never lasted more than a summer. But after Thomas's uncle died, maintaining the land became impossible. Neither of us wanted to become farmers, so we sold it. The sale produced far more money than either of us had ever imagined. Enough to pay off our mortgage, enough to fund retirement, enough to change our lives forever. Thomas suggested something unexpected. We already have enough, he had said one evening. What if we use the rest to leave something behind, not for our family, for our community? Grace continued reading. Rather than discuss the proceeds publicly, we established the Patterson Community Trust to support projects protecting vulnerable older adults. We intentionally kept the trust anonymous because we never wanted family members to view it as future inheritance. I saw Michael's eyebrows rise. The next document bore the official trust seal. Grace compared it with the wax emblem on the envelope. They matched perfectly. She reached another page. Her voice grew quieter. 12 years ago. She stopped, then looked directly at me. The Patterson Community Trust donated nearly $8 million to Cedar Ridge. The room became utterly silent. Angela actually covered her mouth. Michael blinked twice, apparently wondering whether he had misread the figure. Grace checked the document again. No, this is correct. $8 million. My mind drifted backward. I remembered Thomas standing beside me after we signed the donation papers. No one needs to know our names, he had said. If this place helps people grow old with dignity, that's enough. At the time, Cedar Ridge had been on the verge of closing. A combination of financial problems and aging facilities had nearly forced residents to relocate. Thomas hated the idea. He often said that a society could be measured by how it treated those who had already spent their lives building it. The trust funded renovations, a new rehabilitation wing, emergency generators, modern safety systems, a memory care expansion, and one final condition. Grace turned another page. Then she stopped completely. I don't believe this. What is it? Michael asked. She handed him the document. His expression mirrored hers almost instantly. It's written into the governing agreement. What is? Grace looked at me. The Elder Protection Covenant. I nodded. Thomas had insisted upon it. When negotiating the donation, our attorneys requested one unusual provision. If any future resident appeared to have been admitted through coercion, intimidation, or suspected financial exploitation, Cedar Ridge would be required to conduct an independent legal review before relying solely upon family members or powers of attorney. It had seemed like a sensible protection. Neither Thomas nor I imagined it would one day save me. Grace read aloud from the agreement. When credible evidence suggests that an incoming resident may be experiencing financial abuse or involuntary placement, the executive director shall possess independent authority to suspend family access, request emergency legal review, and notify appropriate counsel, regardless of existing admission paperwork. Michael slowly lowered the page. This clause has remained in our governance documents for over a decade. Grace looked astonished. I've referenced it several times during my career. She smiled softly. I never knew who wrote it. I looked toward the window. Thomas did. For several moments, none of us spoke. His voice seemed almost present in the room. Grace carefully removed another certified document. It identified me as the surviving trustee of the Patterson Community Trust. I had no idea, she whispered. I preferred it that way. Mark certainly had no idea. He believed Willow Lane represented nearly everything Thomas and I owned. He never imagined the greatest portion of our estate had quietly left our hands years earlier. Not because we distrusted him, because we believed wealth served people better when it protected dignity rather than feeding expectations. Grace suddenly stood. Michael. Yes. Activate the covenant. He nodded immediately. Within minutes, Cedar Ridge's internal procedures shifted into motion. Security received instructions that no one, not even immediate family, could remove me from the facility without my direct consent and legal verification. The admissions office flagged every document connected to my arrival. The compliance department began preparing a complete investigative record. Grace picked up the telephone once more. This is Grace Holloway, she paused. Please connect me with Susan Bell. The attorney answered almost immediately. Grace summarized everything they had discovered. Susan listened quietly before responding. I'll be there within the hour. She also instructed Grace to preserve every piece of paperwork Mark had submitted. It is now evidence. After ending the call, Grace turned toward me. I owe you an apology. For what? When your son first arrived yesterday, I believed the documents more than I believed you. You weren't the first. I should have asked harder questions. I smiled gently. You asked the one question that mattered. She looked puzzled. Did you agree to be admitted? I remembered her words exactly. You listened to my answer. Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes. I've worked with older adults for 31 years. She looked down briefly. Sometimes families truly are acting out of love, and sometimes they aren't. Yes, she nodded. And distinguishing between those situations may be the most important responsibility we have. An hour later, Susan arrived carrying another leather case. She walked directly toward me and embraced me tightly. I told you we'd be ready. You did. She opened her case and placed several fresh documents on the table. These are emergency court filings. Grace looked over them. What do they accomplish? They immediately challenge the validity of Mark's power of attorney and request temporary protection over Ruth's property until the court reviews the evidence. Michael smiled for the first time that morning. He's not going to be able to sell the house. Susan looked at me. No. Then she glanced toward the stack of forged paperwork Mark had unknowingly handed directly to the one institution legally obligated to investigate elder abuse. He walked into the worst possible place he could have chosen. I looked down at Thomas's photograph resting beside my notebook. For months I had believed I was slowly losing everything. My home, my freedom, my voice. Now I finally understood something Thomas had quietly built years before his death. He had never merely donated money to Cedar Ridge. He had built a shield. And without realizing it, my own son had delivered me straight into its protection. By the following morning, I understood something I had almost forgotten during the whirlwind of revelations. Winning one battle did not mean the war was over. Mark had spent months constructing his version of the truth. I was not going to abandon it simply because Grace opened a red envelope. At 9 o'clock, Susan arrived carrying a stack of fresh court filings. Her expression was calm, but I recognized the look in her eyes. I had seen it many times during the years Thomas and I worked with her. It meant someone else had already made a move. What's happened? I asked. Susan removed her coat before answering. As expected, Mark struck first. My stomach tightened. How? He filed an emergency petition for guardianship yesterday afternoon. Grace looked up sharply. Already? Susan nodded. He claims Cedar Ridge staff manipulated Ruth into believing he committed financial abuse. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the lie had become so enormous that it bordered on absurd. He brought me here against my will. I know, Susan said softly. But his petition tells a different story. She handed me a copy. I forced myself to read. According to Mark's sworn statement, I had become increasingly forgetful after Thomas died. I supposedly wandered outside at night, forgot bills, repeated conversations, accused neighbors of stealing newspapers, refused medication, became suspicious of everyone trying to help me. None of it was true. Yet seeing the lies typed onto official court documents made them feel strangely powerful. I sound like a completely different person. That's intentional, Susan replied. Hy isn't trying to convince you. He's trying to convince a judge. Grace quietly read through this petition. He also claims we're isolating Mrs. Patterson. Exactly. Susan pointed toward another paragraph. He says the facility is influencing her financial decisions. Michael, who had joined us halfway through the meeting, shook his head. The irony would almost be amusing. If it weren't so dangerous, Grace answered. Susan agreed. Guardianship hearings move quickly. She looked directly at me. We have strong evidence. But a courtroom is still a courtroom. I understood. Facts mattered. So did appearances. A devoted son standing beside his elderly mother often looked more convincing than a frightened widow accusing her only child, especially when the accusation sounded unbelievable. Around lunchtime, another problem emerged. Susan's phone rang. She listened for nearly 2 minutes before ending the call. What now? Grace asked. Mark has accelerated the sale of Willow Lane. I felt my chest tighten. I thought the emergency filing protected the house. It will, she paused, if the court grants it in time. She explained that Mark had already contacted a buyer willing to close unusually quickly. Because he believed the forged power of attorney remained valid, he was attempting to complete the transaction before legal challenges could stop him. He needs cash, Susan said. Immediately. For the development. She nodded. Probably. Michael frowned. That's reckless. No, Susan answered. It's desperate. She spread several financial records across the conference table. We've been investigating Riverside Commons. Grace studied the documents. The project is worse than he admitted. Much worse. According to public filings, Mark's investors had withdrawn months earlier. Contractors were suing. Private lenders had begun demanding repayment. Interest penalties accumulated every week. He wasn't trying to rescue a struggling business anymore. He was trying to prevent complete financial collapse, and he intended to use my home to do it. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else. Not because of the money, because I finally understood something about my son. He had crossed the line long before Cedar Ridge. Every lie after that had simply become easier. That afternoon, I walked slowly through the facility gardens. The August air felt warm against my face. Residents chatted nearby while volunteers watered flower beds. Everything looked peaceful. Yet inside my mind, questions refused to settle. How had we reached this point? Could I have prevented it years earlier? Had I ignored warning signs because admitting them would have required believing something terrible about my own child? Grace found me sitting beside the fountain. Mind if I join you? Please. She sat quietly for several moments before speaking. I've been thinking about your testimony. My testimony. If the guardianship hearing goes forward, it will. You'll need to tell your story publicly. I nodded. I know. That won't be easy. No, it wouldn't. The judge would hear intimate details about my marriage, my finances, Thomas's final illness, Mark's debts, everything. There would be no privacy left. Grace looked at the fountain. I've worked with many families, she hesitated. Some older adults decide not to fight because they're tired. Sometimes. Sometimes because they don't want to embarrass their children. I understood that feeling perfectly. No mother dreams of sitting inside a courtroom explaining why her own son forged her signature. The thought alone made my heart ache. Late that afternoon, Susan returned with another visitor, Emma. The moment I saw my granddaughter standing in the hallway, tears filled my eyes. She looked exhausted, dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She clutched her backpack against her chest, as though she were afraid someone might take it away. Grandma! I stood. She hugged me so tightly that neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, Dad said you were sick. I know. He told me the nursing home was your decision. It wasn't. She stepped back. I didn't know who to believe. I gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. You came. I had. She looked around the room. You don't seem confused. I smiled sadly. I've been accused of many things recently. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. No. I lifted her chin. You have nothing to apologize for. She hesitated before asking the question that mattered most. Is Dad really trying to sell your house? The innocence in her voice almost broke me. She still wanted the answer to be no. I could see it. She wanted someone to explain everything away, to tell her it had all been a misunderstanding. I reached for her hand. Emma. Before I could answer, Susan quietly placed one document in front of her. The forged power of attorney. Emma stared at it, then looked at me. That's not your signature. No. She swallowed hard. I've seen your handwriting my whole life. Another silence followed, the kind that changes families forever. She sank slowly into the chair opposite me. I asked Dad last week why he kept saying you couldn't remember things. What did he say? He said, people with memory problems don't realize they're changing. She covered her face briefly. I believed him. I moved beside her. You loved your father. I still do. I know. Her voice trembled. But if this is true, she looked toward the window, then I don't even know who he is anymore. Neither did I. That evening after Emma left, Susan and I reviewed our options. We have enough evidence to defend you, she said. But the guardianship hearing will expose everything. I understand. You could still choose another path. What path? A private settlement. The idea lingered in the room. If I agreed, if I remained silent, if I let Mark quietly reverse course, perhaps the family could avoid public humiliation. Perhaps Emma would not lose both her father and her grandmother at the same time. I looked out the window toward the parking lot where my son had abandoned me only 2 days earlier. Then I remembered his whisper. By the time anyone believes you, the house will already be sold. He had not hesitated to destroy my reputation. He had not hesitated to take my freedom. He had not hesitated to erase my voice. I turned back toward Susan. No, she waited. I won't hide. I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. I spent months hoping this would stay inside our family. I looked down at my wedding ring. It stopped being a private family matter the moment my son used lies to steal another person's life. Susan nodded slowly. Then we'll fight. As she gathered the papers, her phone vibrated again. She read the message. Her expression hardened. What is it? I asked. She looked directly at me. We've confirmed where the money from your house was supposed to go. Where? She placed a newly printed financial report on the table. Across the top appeared the name of a private lending company. They've threatened legal action against Mark. She paused. And according to their records, he has already promised them a large portion of the proceeds from the sale of Willow Lane. My house had never been intended to save his future. It had already been spent. The next morning began with numbers. Not accusations, not tears, numbers. Susan spread nearly 24 folders across the conference table inside Cedar Ridge's administrative office. Every folder represented a different piece of Mark's financial life. Bank statements, public records title searches, loan applications, brokerage reports, credit inquiries, and emails obtained through legal discovery. For the first time, I saw the full picture, and it was worse than I had imagined. I didn't want to show you this until we confirmed everything, Susan said. Grace sat quietly beside me while Michael organized the documents into chronological order. Susan placed one sheet directly in front of me. This is your checking account. I recognized every entry: utility payments, property taxes, grocery purchases, charitable donations. Then my eyes stopped on a transfer I didn't recognize. $18,750. Susan nodded. It was moved from your emergency savings. I never authorized that. We know. She slid another page beside it, then another, and another. By the time she finished, I was staring at 6 unauthorized transactions. Different amounts, different dates. Together they totaled more than $60,000. My hands began trembling. How? The forged power of attorney. Susan's voice remained calm, but I could hear the anger beneath it. He presented it at your bank. Grace looked shocked. They accepted it. They had no reason to suspect it was forged. I leaned back in my chair. Thomas and I had spent decades building those savings. Not because we dreamed of luxury, because we believed peace came from knowing we would never become a burden to anyone. Mark had emptied those accounts in less than 4 months. Susan continued. The unauthorized transfers weren't the end. She opened another folder. This is the home equity application. Although the loan had never been finalized, Mark had completed nearly every step. Had Susan not intervened when she did, the bank would likely have approved it. Then came the property listing agreement. My home, professionally photographed, marketed, prepared for sale, without my knowledge. I looked away. I couldn't bear to see photographs of Willow Lane displayed like merchandise. The kitchen where Thomas danced with me every Christmas. The front porch where Emma learned to ride her bicycle. The maple tree that had shaded nearly half my life, reduced to square footage and asking price. Susan quietly removed the listing brochure. You don't have to look. I do. My voice sounded distant. If I look away now, then he's already taken more than money. Grace reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. No words, just understanding. Susan continued assembling the timeline. The financial exposure now exceeds $200,000. No one spoke. The silence carried more weight than any conversation. Finally, I whispered, "This wasn't one terrible decision." Susan looked at me. "No, this was a plan." And she nodded. "Yes." That realization hurt more than every forged document. A desperate mistake might have happened in one terrible afternoon. This had taken months. Every transfer, every lie, every false medical claim, every conversation with neighbors, every appointment, every signature, one decision after another, each requiring him to wake up every morning and choose deception again. I found myself remembering the little boy who cried after accidentally breaking Mrs. Donnelly's flower pot when he was 9. He had insisted on mowing her lawn every Saturday until he earned enough money to replace it. Where had that child gone? Or had I simply stopped seeing the man he was becoming? Around noon, Dr. Helen Morris arrived. She carried her medical records in a slim black case. "I wanted to prepare you before court," she said. We reviewed the cognitive assessment together. Every score, every observation, every note. She explained exactly how she would testify. "If opposing counsel asks whether grief affected your emotions after Thomas died, I'll answer yes." I looked at her. "Because it did." She smiled gently. "Grief is not incompetence." Those 4 words settled something inside me. For months, Mark had tried to convince others that sadness meant incapacity, that loneliness meant confusion, that age meant surrender. Dr. Morris refused to let those ideas stand. Later that afternoon, Grace entered carrying another folder. "I've completed my statement." She handed me a copy. In clear, careful language, she described everything that had happened during my admission. How Mark answered questions directed at me. How he repeatedly interrupted. How he attempted to control my communication. How he insisted I should not contact my attorney. How he tried to remove my belongings after questions arose. Every detail had been documented. "I wish I'd questioned him sooner," Grace admitted. "You questioned him when it mattered." She smiled sadly. "I'll remember this case for the rest of my career." Susan looked at both of us. "These statements are powerful. But we still need one more thing." I knew immediately what she meant. The recordings. Months earlier, buying the digital recorder had felt almost shameful. A mother should never feel the need to record conversations with her own son. Now those recordings might save everything. Susan connected the recorder to her laptop. One by one we listened. Mark asking for the mortgage. Mark insisting the house would eventually belong to him. Mark becoming angry after I refused. Vanessa quietly encouraging me to sacrifice my security. Every conversation painted the same picture: pressure, manipulation, control. Then Susan opened the final audio file. I think this is the important one. The recording began with the sound of a car engine. I remembered making it. Mark had driven me home after another argument about the house. He didn't know the recorder remained inside my purse. His voice filled the room. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Then mine. I said no. He laughed quietly. You think a judge is going to believe an old widow over her only son? The room became perfectly still. On the recording, I remained silent. Mark continued. Once the house is sold, you won't have enough money to fight anything. I felt cold despite the warm afternoon. Listening to those words now inside Cedar Ridge, I finally understood how openly he had spoken. He had never imagined anyone else would hear him. The recording continued. Another voice entered. Vanessa. She sounded impatient. If she won't cooperate, the nursing home will solve the problem. No one at the table moved. Susan slowly paused the recording. Grace stared at the laptop. They both knew. Yes, I answered. They both knew. Before anyone could speak again, someone knocked gently on the office door. Emma stood outside. She looked nervous. I don't want to interrupt. You aren't. She stepped inside. Susan hesitated. Emma, there's something I think you should hear. I looked toward Susan. She silently asked permission with her eyes. I nodded. Without saying a word, Susan pressed play. Emma listened. She didn't cry immediately. She simply stood motionless while her father's voice filled the room. When the recording ended, she slowly sat down. For several long moments, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, "That's Dad." No one answered. She covered her mouth with one hand. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Fresh tears slid down her face. But that's his voice. She looked at me. He wasn't trying to help you. No. He was planning everything. I nodded. Emma closed her eyes. Then she said something that surprised all of us. I know that second voice. I looked at her. My mother's. Yes. Emma took a shaky breath. I've heard them having conversations like that late at night. She looked toward Susan. If the court asks me, I'll tell the truth. I reached for her hand. Emma, you don't have to choose between us. She looked directly into my eyes. No, Grandma. Her voice was no longer uncertain. I already know who made that choice. Emma remained at Cedar Ridge long after everyone else had left the conference room. Neither of us seemed ready to say goodbye. We walked slowly through the courtyard where the afternoon sun filtered through the old oak trees. Residents played cards beneath a covered patio while a volunteer pushed a gentleman in a wheelchair along the walking path. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost unfair. Inside my heart, everything was still breaking apart. Emma finally spoke. I didn't sleep last night. I can tell. I kept replaying everything Dad has said over the past year. She stopped walking. So many conversations sound different now. I waited. When Grandpa died, Dad kept saying you weren't yourself anymore. She stared down at the brick pathway. I thought he meant you were grieving. I was. But now, her voice cracked. Now I think he was preparing all of us to believe him. I nodded slowly. That's how manipulation works. It rarely begins with one enormous lie. It begins with many small ones. Emma wiped away a tear. I feel so stupid. I took both of her hands. No, I helped him. You didn't know. I should have. You trusted your father. She shook her head. You don't understand. I could see there was something more. She looked around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. About 6 months ago, Dad asked me to help him. My stomach tightened. He said you kept forgetting your online banking password. I already knew where the story was going. He asked me to log into your account because I had helped you set it up years ago. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I thought I was helping you. Emma's voice had become almost a whisper. I didn't transfer any money. I know. But I gave him access. She covered her face. I showed him where everything was. The guilt pouring out of her sounded almost unbearable. I never imagined he would. She couldn't finish the sentence. I gently pulled her into my arms. She had been carrying this weight alone. You were deceived too. But if I hadn't. No. I spoke firmly enough that she looked up. The responsibility belongs to the person who chose to commit the crime, not to the person who believed someone she loved. She searched my face. You really forgive me? There was never anything to forgive. She cried then, not quietly, not politely, the kind of crying that comes when guilt finally discovers mercy. We stood together until the tears stopped. Later that evening, Susan joined us with updated court schedules. The hearing is officially set for next Tuesday. Grace sat beside her. That gives us 5 days. Susan nodded. We'll use every one of them. Before we could discuss strategy further, the receptionist called upstairs. Mr. Mark Patterson is here. Every conversation stopped. Grace looked toward me. You are not obligated to see him. I thought about it. For months I had avoided confrontation because I believed honesty would eventually matter on its own. Now honesty needed witnesses. I'll see him. But not alone. 10 minutes later, we gathered in one of Cedar Ridge's family meeting rooms. Present were Grace, Susan, Michael, and me. Mark entered carrying no briefcase this time, no legal folders, no carefully rehearsed smile. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. For a brief, dangerous second, I saw the little boy who once ran into my arms after falling off his bicycle. Then I remembered Willow Lane, the forged signature, the lies, the nursing home. My heart steadied again. Mom. His voice sounded softer than I had heard in months. I'd like to speak privately. Susan answered before I could. That won't happen. Mark sighed. You've poisoned everyone against me. Grace remained expressionless. We're simply present. He turned back toward me. I made mistakes. I waited. I was under unbelievable pressure. Still, I said nothing. My business collapsed. Silence. I thought I could fix everything before anyone got hurt. Finally, I asked, Did you? He blinked. Did I what? Fix everything. No. Did anyone avoid getting hurt? His shoulders slumped. I never wanted this. I looked directly into his eyes. What exactly didn't you want? He hesitated. I didn't want lawyers. No. My voice remained calm. You didn't want consequences. His expression hardened slightly. You think everything is that simple? No. I think it became simple the moment you decided to forge my signature. He looked away. After several long seconds, he spoke again. If you withdraw the complaint, there is no complaint. The legal action. No. I'll repay everything. With what money? I'll figure it out. You've been saying that for months. His breathing grew heavier. You'd really destroy your own son. The words settled heavily and for years they would have worked. Years ago, guilt would have silenced me. Now they sounded different. I didn't destroy you, Mark. You'll send me to prison. I didn't forge documents. You don't understand how desperate I was. I leaned forward slightly. Then help me understand. He looked relieved, as though he believed the conversation was finally moving in his direction. Instead, I asked the question that had haunted me since Cedar Ridge. If the house had been sold, he nodded cautiously. Were you ever planning to bring me home? The room became perfectly silent. Even Grace seemed to stop breathing. Mark didn't answer. I repeated the question. Were you? He stared at the table. His fingers tightened together. Nearly a full minute passed. Finally he whispered, No. The single word echoed through the room. I couldn't. I kept looking at him. The money would have been gone. He swallowed. The lenders. Another pause. They would have taken everything. So the nursing home was supposed to be temporary at first. At first, his eyes closed. Until the house sold. And afterward, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. He had never planned for me to leave Cedar Ridge. Not because I needed care. Because I had become inconvenient. Outside the meeting room door came the faint sound of someone crying. Grace opened the door. Emma stood in the hallway. She hadn't intended to overhear us. She had arrived during the conversation, but she had heard enough. She stepped slowly into the room. Dad. Mark looked up in shock. Emma. You said Grandma wanted to live here. He stood. I can explain. You said she wasn't safe. I was trying to protect. Stop. Her voice surprised everyone. For the first time in her life, she interrupted her father. Please stop lying. He froze. Tears streamed down her face. I heard everything. She looked toward me, then back at him. You never planned to bring her home. He tried to step closer. She took one step backward. I don't know who you are anymore. Emma. You told me Grandma forgot things. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Her voice shook. You taught me my whole life that honesty matters. She laughed bitterly through tears. And then you did this. Mark reached toward her. She refused to take his hand. I won't lie for you. He looked stunned. She continued quietly. If the judge asks me what I know, she drew one slow breath. I'll tell the truth. No one spoke. Not Susan, not Grace, not even me. The decision had been Emma's alone. Mark stared at his daughter as though he had just realized that he was losing far more than a lawsuit. He was losing the trust of the one person whose opinion still mattered to him. As security escorted him toward the lobby a few minutes later, he turned back one final time. His eyes met mine. For the first time since all of this began, I did not see anger. I did not see confidence. I saw fear. And I knew that when we entered the courtroom the following week, my son would not be facing only his mother. He would be facing the truth. The days before the guardianship hearing passed more slowly than any week I had ever lived. Every sunrise felt like a countdown. Every sunset reminded me that one more opportunity to prepare had disappeared. Susan visited Cedar Ridge each morning with another folder, another witness statement, another legal strategy. She worked methodically, but I could tell even she felt the weight of what lay ahead. This case is strong, she reminded me repeatedly. I know, but strength doesn't erase emotion. She was right. The facts were no longer my greatest challenge. My heart was. One afternoon, I wandered into the library at Cedar Ridge, hoping a familiar smell of old books might quiet my thoughts. Instead, I found 3 residents gathered around a puzzle. One of them, Eleanor, waved me over. You're the librarian, aren't you? I smiled. I used to be. Then you know how to solve impossible things. I wish. She laughed softly. We've all wished that. Over the next hour, the conversation drifted away from puzzles and toward life. No one asked about my court case. No one needed to. Older people recognize certain kinds of pain without explanations. Frank, an 82-year-old retired firefighter, quietly admitted that his nephew had emptied his retirement account years earlier. I didn't report him. Why not? I asked. He shrugged. My sister begged me not to. What happened? He spent everything anyway. Across the table, Eleanor folded another puzzle piece into place. My daughter convinced everyone I couldn't live alone. Were you sick? No. Lonely. She smiled sadly. Apparently, some people can't tell the difference. Another resident, Maria, spoke for the first time. My sons argued over my house while I was sitting in the next room. The room became silent. I heard every word. She looked toward the window. They forgot I was still alive. No one cried. None of us needed to. The stories themselves carried enough sorrow. As I listened, something inside me shifted. For weeks, I had viewed my experience as a private family tragedy. Now I understood it was part of something much larger. Older people often lose their voices long before they lose their abilities. Sometimes because illness steals them. Sometimes because other people decide they are no longer worth hearing. Grace found me later that afternoon. I've been looking for you. I needed to think. She sat beside me in the empty dining room. You've become important to several residents. I smiled faintly. They've become important to me. Grace nodded. They also reminded you of something. Yes. What's that? I looked around the room. I can't fight only for myself anymore. She understood immediately. The courtroom isn't just about Willow Lane. No. It's about every older person who has ever been told their voice doesn't matter. Grace leaned back thoughtfully. Compassion is a beautiful quality. It can also become dangerous. I looked at her. She continued. Many parents confuse forgiveness with surrender. I knew exactly what she meant. I've spent months asking myself whether protecting Mark made me a good mother. And I think protecting him from consequences allowed him to become the man who hurt me. Grace nodded slowly. Loving someone doesn't require helping them continue harming others. Those words stayed with me long after she left. The evening before the hearing, Susan arrived carrying 2 thick binders. "Everything is ready," she sounded confident. Then she paused. "Almost." She handed me a legal pad. "I want you to tell your story." "I've already done that." "Not as evidence." As Ruth. She explained that judges often remembered authentic voices more clearly than perfect legal arguments. "Don't try to sound impressive." "I won't. Tell the truth. I always have." We spent nearly 3 hours preparing. She asked difficult questions. Why hadn't I confronted Mark earlier? Why had I trusted him with financial matters? Why hadn't I reported him sooner? Each answer hurt, because every answer contained love. I had trusted him because he was my son. I had delayed because I wanted to believe he would stop. I had hoped the next conversation would be the one that brought him back. Hope, I discovered, can sometimes become its own kind of blindness. When Susan finally left, darkness had settled outside. I returned to my room exhausted. A handwritten envelope rested on my bedside table. No stamp, no mailing address, only my name. Grace had found it at the front desk. The handwriting belonged to Mark. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Mom, I know you probably hate me. Maybe you should. Everything spun out of control. I never planned for it to reach this point. If you testify tomorrow, I'll lose everything. The business, my marriage, my reputation, maybe even my freedom. Please don't let strangers decide what happens to our family. Whatever I've done, I'm still your son. Is a house really worth destroying your only child?" I read the letter twice, then a third time. The words hurt because they contained pieces of truth. He was my son. He had ruined his life. The consequences would be severe. For several minutes, I simply stared at Thomas's photograph. "What would you do?" I whispered. The room, of course, remained silent. I found paper and began writing. "Dear Mark, I have never loved a house more than I loved my son. If this were only about money, I would have given you everything I owned. But this is not about a house. It is about trust. It is about freedom. It is about the day you decided I was easier to control than to respect. You ask whether a house is worth destroying your only child. I ask whether your mother's life was worth saving your business. I still love you. That has never changed. But love cannot survive where truth is forbidden. Tomorrow I will tell the truth. Not because I want to punish you, because I can no longer protect your lies." I finished writing. Then I folded the letter. I never placed it in an envelope. I never intended to send it. Susan was right. My testimony would become my answer. The next morning arrived gray and unusually cool. Court was only a few hours away. Grace drove with Susan while I sat quietly in the back seat watching Ohio farmland pass outside the window. The same fields reminded me of the property Thomas and I had sold so many years earlier. The land that had eventually protected me. As we approached the courthouse, Susan's phone rang. She listened carefully, then smiled for the first time that morning. "What is it?" I asked. "We've confirmed one more thing." She opened another document. The same forged power of attorney was used at the bank. She turned one page. "The real estate office." Another page. "And here at Cedar Ridge." She looked directly at me. "He repeated the exact same forgery everywhere." I nodded slowly. So his attorney can no longer argue this was an isolated mistake." She closed the folder. "It establishes a deliberate pattern." I looked up at the courthouse steps waiting ahead. For months, Mark had believed repeating the same lie would eventually make it true. Today, those repeated lies had become the very evidence that would expose him. I stepped out of the car, took one deep breath, and walked toward the courthouse doors, knowing that by the end of the day, my voice would no longer belong only to me. The county probate courtroom was smaller than I expected. There were no dramatic speeches waiting to happen, no thunderous music, no cheering crowd, just polished wooden benches, quiet conversations, legal folders stacked neatly on tables, and a judge who had undoubtedly heard hundreds of family disputes before ours. To everyone else, it was another Tuesday morning. To me, it felt like the day my entire life would either be returned or disappear forever. Susan adjusted the files in front of us one last time. "Remember?" she whispered. "Answer only the question you're asked." I nodded. "I know." "You don't need to convince anyone by sounding perfect." I smiled faintly. "I've never been perfect." "Exactly." Across the courtroom, Mark sat beside his attorney. He wore the same navy suit he had worn to Thomas's funeral. For one painful second, I remembered fastening his crooked tie before he attended his high school graduation. I quickly forced the memory away. Some memories strengthen you, others weaken your resolve. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered and took her seat. After reviewing the case file, she looked calmly toward both legal teams. "We're here regarding the petition for emergency guardianship concerning Mrs. Ruth Patterson." She adjusted her glasses. "Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed." Mark's attorney rose confidently. He was experienced, polished, calm. He did not portray Mark as greedy. He portrayed him as devoted. "My client is a son attempting to protect his elderly mother during a period of significant emotional decline following the death of her husband." He spoke gently, respectfully, carefully. He described my grief, my loneliness, the ordinary sadness of widowhood. Then little by little he transformed those truths into something else: confusion, impaired judgment, poor decision-making. He claimed Cedar Ridge employees and Susan Bell had manipulated me into believing ordinary family disagreements amounted to financial abuse. Listening to him felt strangely surreal. Every true detail was wrapped around a lie. By the time he finished, I hardly recognized the woman he had described. Susan stood. "Your Honor, the petitioner has built his argument upon assumptions while ignoring documented evidence." She called Dr. Helen Morris first. Dr. Morris testified calmly. She explained my cognitive examination in detail. Every score, every observation, every conclusion. Mark's attorney stood for cross-examination. "Doctor, isn't it true that grief can affect memory?" "Yes." "So Mrs. Patterson experienced memory lapses after her husband's death. Like many grieving people, she occasionally misplaced objects or forgot minor tasks." He smiled. "So she did forget things." Dr. Morris never changed her expression. "Forgetting where you placed your reading glasses is not the same as lacking legal capacity." A few people in the courtroom quietly nodded. The attorney continued. "Would you agree Mrs. Patterson became emotionally distressed after losing her husband?" "Of course. And emotional distress affects judgment." Dr. Morris folded her hands. "Being heartbroken does not prevent someone from understanding financial documents." Silence. The attorney tried again. "Doctor, have you ever forgotten an appointment?" She smiled slightly. "Yes." "Does that mean you're mentally incompetent?" The courtroom became noticeably quieter. "No. Neither is Mrs. Patterson." The attorney returned to his seat. Grace Holloway testified next. She described my arrival at Cedar Ridge exactly as it had happened. How Mark answered questions directed toward me. How he attempted to prevent me from contacting my attorney. How the red envelope had been discovered. How the forged paperwork conflicted with verified medical records. Then came Susan. She carefully introduced the revoked power of attorney, the certified notices, the financial records, the forged signatures. The judge examined each document personally. Finally, Susan requested permission to admit the complete resident protection file into evidence. Mark's attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, this material unfairly prejudices the petitioner." Judge Whitmore looked toward Susan. Response. "The file was created months before Mrs. Patterson's admission." Susan remained composed. "It contains contemporaneous evidence documenting anticipated financial exploitation." The judge reviewed several pages silently, then looked toward Mark's attorney. "Objection overruled." A quiet wave of relief moved through our side of the courtroom. The evidence would be heard. Then my name was called. I slowly walked to the witness stand. The oath felt heavier than I expected, perhaps because I already understood what telling the truth would cost. Susan approached gently. Mrs. Patterson, how long were you married? 48 years. What did your husband do? He taught high school history. What did you do? I was a school librarian. Were you capable of managing your finances after your husband's death? Yes. Did you voluntarily admit yourself to Cedar Ridge? No. Did you authorize your son to sell your home? Never. Did you sign the power of attorney presented by Mr. Patterson? I did not. Susan paused. Mrs. Patterson, why didn't you report your son sooner? The courtroom became perfectly still, because everyone wanted the answer. I looked briefly toward Mark, then back at Susan. Because I loved him. No one moved. I kept believing the next conversation would be different. I swallowed carefully. I thought if I remained patient, the son I raised would come back. Susan nodded. No further questions. Cross-examination began. Mark's attorney approached slowly. Mrs. Patterson. His voice remained polite. You've acknowledged forgetting minor things after your husband's death. Yes. So your memory isn't perfect. No one's is, he smiled. You also admit becoming lonely. Yes. And emotional. Yes. So isn't it possible your son genuinely believed you needed help? I looked directly at him. If he believed I needed help, I paused. He wouldn't have forged my signature. The attorney hesitated. He changed direction. Mrs. Patterson, do you remember forgetting grocery items? Sometimes. Do you remember repeating stories? Occasionally. So your son had legitimate concerns. I folded my hands together. I've repeated stories since I was 30. A few quiet chuckles echoed through the courtroom. My husband repeated the same fishing story every Thanksgiving. Even Judge Whitmore smiled faintly. I continued. Forgetting milk at the grocery store does not mean someone should lose their home. The attorney returned to his table. His strategy had failed. Next came Emma. She looked terrified, yet she walked confidently to the witness stand. Susan asked only a few questions. Did your father ever discuss your grandmother's finances? Yes. Did he ask you to help access her online accounts? Yes. Did you believe he was helping her? I did. Then came the difficult part. Mark's attorney stood. Emma, you love your father. Yes. And your grandmother. Yes. So this is difficult. The hardest thing I've ever done. Has anyone pressured you to testify today? She looked toward me, then toward Susan. No. What changed your mind? Emma took a slow breath. I heard my father's own words. Susan asked permission to play the recording. Judge Whitmore approved. The courtroom filled with Mark's recorded voice. You think a judge is going to believe an old widow over her only son. Once the house is sold, you won't have enough money to fight anything. Then Vanessa's voice. If she won't cooperate, the nursing home will solve the problem. The recording ended. No one spoke. Mark stared down at the table. Susan called one final witness, a forensic handwriting examiner. He compared genuine signatures with the forged power of attorney using enlarged photographs displayed before the court. Point by point, stroke by stroke. Pressure, spacing, pen lifts. His conclusion was absolute. The questioned signature was not written by Mrs. Ruth Patterson. Judge Whitmore quietly closed the evidence file. She removed her glasses, looked directly at Mark, then at me. Finally, she began reading her decision. The court finds overwhelming evidence that Mrs. Ruth Patterson possesses full legal capacity, she continued. The guardianship petition is denied. I closed my eyes briefly, but the judge wasn't finished. The purported power of attorney is declared null and void. Another pause. Any attempted sale or encumbrance of Mrs. Patterson's residence based upon that document is immediately invalidated. Susan gently squeezed my arm. Then came the final words. Based upon the evidence presented today, this court refers the matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into alleged forgery, financial exploitation of an elderly adult, and related offenses. The courtroom remained silent. I looked toward Mark. For the first time since this nightmare began, he lowered his eyes. Walking out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that comes after a sleepless night, but the kind that settles into your bones after carrying grief for too long. The cameras waiting outside belonged to local news stations covering an elder abuse awareness initiative. None of them recognized me, and I was grateful. Susan politely declined every request for comment. "This isn't the end of the story," she whispered as we reached her car. "No, it rarely is." She was right. The judge had returned my legal rights. She had protected my home. She had referred Mark's actions for criminal investigation. But court orders could not restore the years of trust that had disappeared. Nor could they erase the memory of hearing my own son admit he had never intended to bring me home. 3 days later, I stood once again in front of the brick house on Willow Lane. Grace insisted on driving me herself. "I've wanted to see the famous maple tree," she joked gently. I smiled. "So have I." The front yard looked almost unchanged. Late summer flowers still bordered the walkway. The porch swing Thomas built 20 years earlier still hung from its chains. Yet as soon as I unlocked the front door, I understood that something fundamental had changed. The house felt disturbed, not damaged, disturbed. Furniture had been moved, cabinets stood half empty. Several framed photographs were missing from the living room wall. The antique clock Thomas inherited from his father had disappeared. My heart sank. "He was preparing the house," I whispered. Susan walked slowly through the dining room. "He probably expected a quick sale." I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. Closets had been searched, desk drawers emptied, boxes left open. Nothing of great financial value remained missing. Instead, Mark had taken things that made staging the house easier. Personal photographs, handmade quilts, family keepsakes, objects that reminded buyers someone had actually lived there. I opened the top drawer of Thomas's bedside table. His old pocket watch was still inside. I closed my eyes and held it tightly. "They missed this." Grace smiled. "Some treasures don't look expensive." Over the next week, Emma practically moved into Willow Lane. Without being asked, she spent every afternoon helping me put the house back together. We rehung photographs, returned books to their shelves, replanted flowers someone had neglected to water. One evening, she climbed onto a chair and carefully nailed the old family height chart back beside the pantry door after it had been removed during preparations for the sale. She stepped back. "There." I looked at the pencil marks. Mark, age 7, age 12, age 16. Emma, age 5, age 9, age 14. History had returned to the wall where it belonged. "Thank you," I whispered. She hugged me. "I'm rebuilding my home too." A month after the hearing, the prosecutor formally filed criminal charges: forgery, financial exploitation of an elderly adult, attempted fraud, several related financial offenses. Mark initially insisted on fighting every allegation. His attorney requested continuances, additional investigations, expert reviews. Then the forensic evidence continued growing. Bank employees identified him. Real estate agents confirmed the forged paperwork. Notaries denied witnessing my signature. One by one, the walls closed around him. Eventually, his attorney requested plea negotiations. Susan explained the proposal carefully. "Your opinion matters. What are the options? If the case goes to trial, he risks a significantly longer sentence. And if he accepts responsibility, the prosecution is willing to recommend reduced prison time in exchange for full restitution surrender of all claims to your property and cooperation." I listened quietly. There had been a time when I would have done almost anything to spare my son embarrassment. Now I understood something different. Mercy without accountability is not mercy. It is permission. "I won't interfere." Susan nodded. "I thought you'd say that." The plea agreement was finalized several weeks later. Mark admitted guilt to multiple felony charges. He agreed to repay every dollar that could be recovered. He permanently surrendered any legal claim to my estate. He accepted a custodial sentence, followed by supervised release and mandatory counseling focused on financial exploitation and elder abuse. Vanessa entered a separate plea related to her role in the fraud. She avoided prison, but received probation financial penalties and a permanent court order, preventing her from managing any of my personal or financial affairs. When the hearings ended, I expected relief. Instead, I cried all the way home. Not because justice had failed, because justice had succeeded. No mother dreams of watching her child stand before a judge admitting crimes against her. Months passed. Autumn covered Willow Lane with red and gold leaves. Life slowly became recognizable again. One afternoon, Susan called. "I received something for you." "What is it?" "A letter." "From who?" She hesitated. "Mark." I stared silently through the kitchen window. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You don't have to read it today." But curiosity eventually won. That evening, I opened the envelope. The handwriting looked less confident than before. Mom. For the first time in my life, no one believes my excuses. Not the judge, not my attorney, not even myself. I've spent weeks trying to decide whether to ask for forgiveness. I realized I haven't earned the right, so instead I'll simply tell the truth. Everything you said in court was accurate. I lied. I forged your signature. I convinced myself I was borrowing time. Instead, I stole trust. I blamed pressure, debt, fear. None of those things forced me to become dishonest. I chose dishonesty. I don't know whether you'll ever speak to me again. If you don't, I'll understand. I only hope that someday you might believe this one sentence. I'm finally sorry for what I did. Not only for what happened to me, but for what I did to you. Love, Mark. I finished reading and placed the letter on the kitchen table. Grace happened to call later that evening. "How are you?" I looked at the letter. "I don't know." "Did he apologize?" "Yes." "And I think—" I searched for the right words. "I think this is the first letter he's ever written without trying to manipulate me." Grace remained silent. "I don't forgive him yet." "You don't have to. I still love him." "I know. But love doesn't erase consequences anymore." Grace's voice softened. "That's wisdom, Ruth." A week later, Susan visited with one final stack of paperwork. "Estate planning." I laughed quietly. "Already? Especially now." We rewrote everything. Not to punish Mark. Not out of revenge. Instead, every legal document now required independent oversight. No single family member could ever again control my finances, healthcare, or housing decisions without outside review. The Patterson Community Trust would supervise every major decision if I ever truly became incapable. When we finished signing, Susan closed the folder. "You've protected yourself." I smiled. "No." I looked around the familiar kitchen where Thomas and I had shared thousands of ordinary mornings. "I've protected the woman I hope I'll still be someday." 1 year later, I unlocked the front door of Cedar Ridge with my own key. Not because I lived there, because I had been invited back. Every Thursday morning, I parked beneath the same maple trees that had once watched me arrive, believing my life was over. Instead of carrying a suitcase, I carried a leather binder filled with resident rights information, emergency legal contacts, and handwritten notes from families asking for guidance. Life has a strange way of returning you to the places where you were broken. Sometimes not to remind you of your pain, but to show you how far you've traveled. Grace greeted me in the lobby with the same warm smile she had worn the day she chose to listen instead of assuming. "Good morning, Madam Chair." I laughed. "Please don't call me that. You earned it." 6 months after the court case ended, Cedar Ridge had established a permanent resident rights committee. Grace insisted I lead it. At first I refused. "I've never chaired anything except a library book club." She smiled. "Exactly. You know how to help people find what they've lost." Perhaps she was right. Every week I met with residents and their families. Sometimes they needed legal referrals. Sometimes they needed help understanding powers of attorney. Sometimes they simply needed someone willing to ask an older person the simplest question in the world. What do you want? I had learned that too many people stopped asking. The Patterson Community Trust also entered a new chapter. Rather than allowing the funds to remain focused only on Cedar Ridge, the trustees approved a new initiative, the Thomas and Ruth Patterson Elder Justice Program. When Grace unveiled the small bronze plaque near the entrance, I stood silently beside her. It read, "Every older adult deserves dignity, independence, and a voice that cannot be taken away." Beneath those words were our names. Thomas would have blushed. He never enjoyed recognition, yet I hoped he would have understood. This wasn't about honoring us. It was about reminding people that preparation could become protection. The program funded free legal consultations for seniors' emergency document reviews, financial abuse education, and independent competency evaluations whenever families questioned an older adult's decision-making. Within the first year, dozens of families received help. Some conflicts ended peacefully. Others uncovered genuine exploitation before lives were destroyed. Each success reminded me why Thomas had insisted the trust remain focused on dignity rather than wealth. Emma graduated from Ohio State that spring. Watching her cross the stage brought tears I no longer tried to hide. Not because she earned a degree, because she had survived the hardest year of her life without allowing bitterness to define her. After graduation, she surprised everyone. Instead of accepting a corporate position, she joined a nonprofit organization advocating for older adults facing financial exploitation. When reporters covering the organization's annual fundraiser asked why she had chosen that career, she answered simply, "My grandmother taught me that growing older should never mean becoming invisible." I watched from the audience with tears in my eyes. She had transformed heartbreak into purpose, exactly as Thomas always hoped our family would. People often asked whether I ever saw Mark again. The answer is yes. Several months after his sentencing, I requested a visit. Grace worried it might reopen old wounds. Susan asked whether I was certain. I was. The correctional facility looked exactly as I imagined. Gray walls, metal doors, long hallways echoing with footsteps. When Mark entered the visitation room, he looked older than his years. The confidence that once filled every room had disappeared. He sat quietly across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't." "I'm glad you did." We talked for nearly an hour. Not about legal documents, not about money, about responsibility, about choices, about truth. He apologized again. This time there were no excuses, no references to business failures, no attempts to blame pressure, only ownership. When he finished, I looked directly into his eyes. "I still love you." His shoulders began trembling. "But listen carefully." He nodded. "I will never again confuse loving you with protecting you from the consequences of your choices." He lowered his head. "I understand." "If we're ever going to rebuild anything," I searched for the right words, "it won't happen because you asked for forgiveness." He looked up. "It will happen because you live differently." He nodded slowly. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying." "I hope you do." Whether he ultimately succeeded was no longer mine to control. Love cannot force change. It can only recognize it when it becomes real. Before I left, he thanked me for coming. As I walked toward the exit, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I wasn't carrying anger. Not because everything had been repaired, because I had finally set it down. One Thursday afternoon, nearly a year after I first entered Cedar Ridge against my will, Grace asked me to stop by her office. She opened a familiar cabinet. Inside rested the red file, the same envelope, the same wax seal, the same documents that had saved my freedom. "I believe this belongs to you." She handed it across the desk. I held it gently. Memories flooded back. The fear, the betrayal, the uncertainty. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then I smiled. "I don't think it belongs in my house anymore." Grace looked puzzled. "No." I stood and carried the envelope toward the new Elder Justice office established through the Patterson Community Trust. A glass display case stood near the entrance. Inside were educational materials explaining residents' rights and warning signs of financial exploitation. I carefully placed the red envelope in the center. Beside it sat a small card. It read, "Preparation is not distrust, it is dignity." Grace read the words quietly. "I like that." "So do I." As we stood together, several new residents entered the building with their families. Some looked frightened, some looked hopeful, some looked uncertain. I silently prayed that every one of them would be heard before anyone decided what was best for them. When I returned home that evening, the setting sun painted the old maple tree outside Willow Lane in shades of gold and amber. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea exactly where Thomas and I had spent countless autumn evenings. The house was quiet, not lonely, peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened. A son who believed age meant weakness, a director who chose to ask one more question, an attorney who prepared before disaster arrived, a granddaughter brave enough to choose truth over comfort, and a husband who years before his death quietly built a shield he hoped would never be needed. People sometimes tell me I was lucky. I don't think that's quite right. Luck may have opened a door, but courage walked through it. If my story proves anything, I hope it is. This growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. Love does not require surrendering your dignity. And no matter how late life seems to become, it is never too late to stand up, tell the truth, and reclaim the life that has always belonged to you. Looking back on everything that happened, I've realized that the greatest danger of growing older is not wrinkles, gray hair, or even loneliness. The greatest danger is allowing someone else to convince you that your voice no longer matters. Age does not erase wisdom. It does not erase the right to make your own choices, to protect what you have built, or to be treated with dignity and respect. I also learned that love and trust are not the same thing. We often believe that because we love someone, we must overlook every warning sign, forgive every betrayal, or carry every burden they create. But true love never demands that we surrender our freedom, our self-respect, or our future. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Holding someone accountable is not revenge. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves, and even for those who have hurt us, is to let truth take its rightful place. If my story has taught you anything, I hope it is this: prepare before a crisis comes. Keep your important documents in order. Choose people you trust wisely. Ask questions. Seek independent advice. And never be ashamed to speak up if something feels wrong. Your life, your home, your memories, and your voice are worth protecting. Most importantly, never believe that it is too late to begin again. Even after betrayal, heartbreak, and unimaginable disappointment, healing is still possible. Justice may not erase the scars, but it can give you the freedom to stop living as a victim. Every sunrise offers another chance to reclaim your peace, rebuild your confidence, and become a source of hope for someone else who feels alone. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Do you think I made the right decision by telling the truth and allowing my son to face the consequences of his actions? What would you have done if you had been in my place? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I know your experiences may encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if stories about family, courage, justice, forgiveness, and second chances speak to your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next emotional story. Wherever you're watching from, thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself, cherish the people who truly cherish you, and never let anyone convince you that your voice